Hello, I'm Kyle Warmack with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through first-person portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to both nonprofit and for-profit organizations across West Virginia. History Alive is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. They are entertaining and educational. We encourage your organization, school, or event to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question and answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Alive presenters have researched a variety of sources, such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Alive presentation is not a play. It is an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Alive presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Alive presentation can add to your program offerings. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Alive character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio, Walt Disney.
It all started with a mouse. At least that's what I like to say. In fact, if you get right down to it, there was a rabbit before the mouse, and there was the Alice series before that, and before any of it, there was just me, Walt, a kid from Marceline, Missouri. Yes, born in Chicago, December 5th, 1901, and for a time, one of the most prolific paper boys in Kansas City, but always just Walt. I feel like I've always been from Marceline. My father, Elias, was trained as a carpenter, but he saw himself as an entrepreneur. And that's what brought us to Marceline and the small whitewashed farmhouse on some 30 acres next to the several hundred my Uncle Robert owned. To tell the truth, more things of importance happened to me in Marceline than have happened since, or are likely to in the future. Things I mean like seeing my first circus parade, attending my first school, seeing my first motion picture. I know you'll agree with me that such firsts as these are amongst the most important in a human being's life. We arrived in Marceline when I was 5, and we stayed until I was 9. I remember clearly the day we first arrived on the train. A Mr. Kaufman met us at the station in his wagon, and we rode out just outside the city limits to what was then called the Crane Farm. And my first impression of it was that it had a beautiful front yard with lots of weeping willow trees. The Taylors lived on one side of us and Doc Sherwood on the other. One of my fondest childhood memories is of Doc Sherwood. He used to encourage me in my drawings. He'd give me little presents for my efforts. Once, I think he must have held a horse of his nearly all day so that I could draw it. Well, the outcome wasn't so hot, but Doc, he made me think it was tops. My brother, Roy, he likes to remind me of another art project I took on around that time when I decided to paint a mural on the side of the family's house with pitch. Well, the outcome was slightly frightening, and I wasn't thanked for my efforts by the family. I don't have any memories of being sad in Marceline. I just remember wonderful times, performing as Peter Pan in the school play, or riding around on the back of our horse Charlie until he'd get tired of us and he'd walk through an apple orchard using the branches to scrape us off of his back. The whole family was together, and my mother had a wonderful sense of humor. My father, old Elias, now he could be a hard man. There were 4 of us Disney brothers and our little sister Ruth. Although my oldest brothers, Herbert and Raymond, they moved out in the middle of the night through a window when they had had just about enough of Dad. And Elias turned out not to be such a great farmer. It affected his health, and we lost the farm. had to auction everything we owned, and Elias had a new business venture. We were moving to Kansas City, where he'd bought a paper route, which promised to be very profitable. After all, he had me to deliver the papers for free. And so there I was, 9 years old, waking up at 3:30 every morning to make my rounds, and it was a rough go for sure, but there were occasionally some upsides, like when the owner of the paper, to thank all of us newsboys, he rented a huge theater. It was about 14,000 seats, and he showed us a film, Snow White. I was mesmerized, and I knew then I wanted to be in show business. The family stayed in Kansas City until 1917, when Elias had yet another business opportunity, and he sold the newspaper and he bought stock in a jelly company. We moved again, this time to Chicago, where I was able to enroll in the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. I took some classes. I had high hopes of becoming a newspaper cartoonist. But I was young, and I was looking for adventure, and there was a war happening. My older brother Roy had already signed up to be in the Navy, and I wanted to be part of the Red Cross ambulance service. Of course, their enlistment age was only 17, but I was only 16 at the time. It is fascinating, though, what a little bit of skill with a pen can do to your birth date on an enlistment form. The flu set me back, though, and my friends were deployed without me, and by the time I got to Europe, the action was about over, and so I spent some time just driving around with my ambulance, seeing the sights until homesickness set in, and I was on my way back to the States, this time back to Kansas City. I decided to take some of the money I had saved and to stake myself while I tried to make it as an artist. I found a job with Pessman Rubin, an advertising agency doing artwork for some of their ads, and they had a whole team of young guys just like me, and I got along swell with them. Especially this one kid named Ub Iwerks. Now, I could draw, but not like Ub. He and I got along so well, we decided to go into business together. So we started Iwerks Disney. Like a lot of young men, we dreamed of building a great company, one which could stand the test of time, and Iwerks Disney was not that company. We folded after a month. But we knew we worked well together. So we both took jobs with the Kansas City Slide Company, soon to become the Kansas City Film Ad Company. Their whole business was creating slides, which would run before feature films, advertisements, that sort of thing. And they were experimenting with a new gimmick, animation. Now, what they were doing was very crude animation. It was just little paper cutouts they would pin to the paper and then move back and forth to create some sense of motion. But I was fascinated. I wanted to read everything I could on the subject of animation, which turns out didn't take very long. There was just the one book at the time. But soon I had an itch. I wanted to start another company before I got old and turned 21. So in 1922, I incorporated Laugh-O-Gram Films. I convinced a local theater owner, Mr. Newman, that he would show some of my animated shorts, and I started hiring people as apprentices, paid in experience only, and I convinced others to come aboard, agreeing to deferred payments while we hustled to get these pictures out on time. We found investors. We raised $15,000. We had our own studio and our own camera, but it was a rough go at first. We needed some way to figure out what we were doing. How did these big cartoonists out in New York do all this? So one of the fellow's girlfriends worked down at the film distributor's office, and she would cut out a few feet of film from one of the old cartoons and pass it off to us, and we would study it, trying to see how the Fleischers and these guys did these things. We were young and having the time of our lives at Laugh-O-Gram. But we weren't, strictly speaking, making any money. The creditors began to call. I gave up my rented room and started sleeping on the floor of the studio. More than once a server came to the door and he would say, "Is Mr. Dinsey here?" And there I would be, not a penny to my name, having to explain to him, "No one named Dinsey works here." But time caught up with us. They took the studio and I was down, but not out. After all, what was I doing trying to make movies in Kansas City? I took the camera and I did some baby portraits, and then I sold the camera and took all that money and I bought a first-class ticket to California. My big brother, Roy, he'd moved west years earlier. He had come down with TB while in the service. He'd been sent to a respite home out there. When I arrived, I spent a few weeks just prowling around, seeing the sights and going around movie sets. Then I went to Roy and I explained to him that he was going to go ahead and get better now so he could help me start my own studio. Well, Roy was never very good at saying no to his kid brother, and so off we went to begin Disney Brothers Studios. Roy would take care of the business, I would take care of the art, and that's how it's been since. Now, when we started Disney Brothers Studios in 1923, it really was just that. It was me and Roy. Roy was our camera operator and business manager, and I was our writer and one and only animator. We'd been on the verge of success back at Laugh-O-Gram, I felt, with our final picture there, which was Alice's Wonderland. I thought it could work on a larger scale if I had the right audience. I wrote to a distributor, Margaret Winkler, to see if she might be interested in it. She had handled the Felix the Cat series, and she said she would take a look at the reel, so I sent it to her. She wrote back that we were in business together. Well, the Alice pictures, they started to catch on. Soon I was able to start hiring my pals back from Kansas City to come out to California with us, Iworks included. We even had to hire a few girls to help out with the inking. I hired this one gal, Lillian, in 1924, and by that time I'd saved enough money to buy my own car. None of our ink girls had cars, and so I would offer them all rides home. Lillian lived the closest to us, the closest to the studio, but I always managed to drop her off last. She wasn't a very good ink girl, and so I made her my secretary. And boy, was she worse at that. Never mind that we were in love, I had to marry her just to get her off the payroll. So in 1925, we got hitched. And in 1926, we moved the studios to a larger location on Hyperion Avenue, and we renamed it the Walt Disney Studio. And it was around this time my distributor, Margaret, had married as well to a fellow named Charles Mintz. When Margaret got pregnant, he took over a lot of the business operations, and he and I didn't get along very well. I'd grown tired of the Alice series. I wanted to do pure animation, and we had an opportunity to do it, too. Our Oswald the Lucky Rabbit series had become very popular. I knew that Mintz needed Oswald, and I felt like I could finally leverage this for some real money to be able to grow my studio and make it better. So Lily and I boarded a train, and we went to New York, where I was to meet with Mintz about contract negotiations. And that's when I learned that my Lucky Rabbit, my Oswald, wasn't mine at all. Mintz owned him, and he had no intention of renewing my contract. In fact, he had gone out and he had hired almost all of my cartoonists out from under me to work directly for him on the Oswalds. I was devastated. Lily and I boarded the train, young, unsure of what our futures would hold, if I could even keep the studio together at this point. And I was furious. I kept saying over and over again, I'll never work for anyone else as long as I live. And to calm myself down, I sketched. I sketched a mouse. I wanted to call him Mortimer, but Lily thought something shorter with a bit more pluck would be better. Try Mickey, she said. Now, Mintz had taken almost everyone from me, but he had failed to woo Iworks. And it was who would help me redesign the character. He had to be circles, mostly. That way an animator could get the exact size of Mickey's head by plopping a quarter down on a piece of paper. Time was of the essence. How quickly could we draw this? Well, there were days when could turn out 700 frames. We were still under contract for 2 more Oswald cartoons, and so we'd go in during the day and work alongside these other artists who had already agreed to leave us, and then at night, in secret, we would work on Mickey Mouse. We did a cartoon called Plane Crazy, and it was fine, but it was nothing too different from what we'd already done with our Oswald pictures before. And then I saw a film, The Jazz Singer, and I knew Mickey had to be different. Mickey Mouse had to be seen and heard. Sound produced to run in sync with the animation. Music, sound effects, everything. Mickey's premiere would come in a parody of a Buster Keaton film, Steamboat Bill Jr. Ours was Steamboat Willie. And with it, we had a hit on our hands. Mickey Mouse was all the rage. Soon, Mickey Mouse clubhouses started popping up all across the country. Mickey Mouse was here to stay.
As I mentioned earlier in the show, History Alive is an interactive experience. And since we have no live audience with us in the studio today, it is my privilege to sit down with today's guest from history. Thanks for joining us, Walt.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to asking you some questions today.
Certainly.
One of the things that you pointed out in your monologue is that during all of the trials and tribulations that you've endured to get here, it sounds like you went through quite a bit. Was there any point at which you wanted to turn back? Was there ever a backup career that you had in mind?
Oh, yes. When I was younger, I very much wanted to be an actor. My best friend Walt and I, we performed around town as the two Walts, doing mostly Charlie Chaplin routines. When Laugh-O-Gram didn't turn out the way that I had hoped that it would, and I was looking to move to California, I wasn't sure I wanted to continue with animation. Frankly, I felt I'd just arrived too late. I looked at what other artists on the East Coast had already done, and I thought, well, animation's done. Everything that's going to happen has happened, and so I'll move on to something else. When I got to California and I was going around the movie sets, I had a fun time just seeing how things were made, frankly. I still had my press credentials that I had attained at Laugh-O-Gram, and thankfully nobody checked where they were from, so I was able to get onto the movie lots. But I got to see some great directors working, and I still wanted to be an actor, and I actually did audition and was cast because I was always a good rider of horses, to ride a horse as an extra in a Western. Unfortunately, the day we were supposed to shoot, it rained, and they never called me back.
So you never got your chance.
I never got my chance. Who knows what could have happened there?
Well, you mentioned animation and how you thought that everything that could be explored perhaps already had been. As you progressed, were there any technical breakthroughs that you and your fellow animators at Disney came up with that separated the Walt Disney Company from its competitors? What makes Disney animation so special?
Well, sure. I would say there's a few things we did in the process that perhaps were a bit different than our competitors. To my knowledge, we were the first to really institute the pencil test, meaning that we would sketch out all of our plans beforehand and do what we call storyboards to really see how each scene was going to take place. Animation had typically, at that point when we were starting out, been done more as a singular artist in most cases. One artist handling one scene and taking it all the way through. So this idea of animation is more of a collaborative process and more attention paid to the actual story within the artwork, adding secondary motion so that a character wasn't just walking along and stopped completely and then only their face moved when they talked. That's not how people talk, so we wanted them to have that sense of realism. We wanted to add that secondary motion. We also advanced some new technological features. Mickey Mouse being the first sound cartoon was no easy feat. When I went to New York to work with the orchestra that we had hired to do the sound on Mickey Mouse, we had first been making all the sounds and all the music together in the studio live. That's how we kind of planned everything out. So we had this animated piece that we knew could work, but we went to work with the orchestra. Nobody could get the timing right. We spent quite a bit of money trying to get the timing right on Steamboat Willie, and finally I had an idea to add a little bouncing ball at the bottom of the film so that they could keep the time with what we were showing, and it worked. So we went through the first sound cartoon, of course, the three-color Technicolor process, which we were able to hold on to for some time now, and then the Multiplane Camera, which I feel we've truly perfected.
It's very impressive. Was that multiplane camera something that you use, something you don't get to in your talk today because it's a shorter version of your usual presentation, is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Yes.
Was that something that you used on that film as well?
We certainly did. We actually, we perfected it closer to the end of Snow White's production, so there were a few scenes we had to go back and reshoot because I really wanted them done with that multiplane camera. We were first able to test it out in Silly Symphonies. So Silly Symphonies for me have really been a wonderful venue to test new forms within this medium and to really push animation forward. So we first tested in the old mill, our Silly Symphony, the multiplane camera, and then we were able to use it to great acclaim in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Wonderful. So that film, which came out, remind me what year Snow White came out?
1937.
1937. And it was a smash hit, right?
Oh, yes.
Wonderful. What do you think is the secret to Snow White's success?
Well, I think it has something for everyone. When we went to make Snow White, we didn't want to make just a kids' movie. I think for a lot of people, cartoons have been kind of placed into this category that animation is something for children and that adults simply couldn't enjoy it. When I first proposed that we were going to be making our first animated feature, I had plenty of critics who thought it was just a ridiculous idea. They called it Disney's folly. There were a number of issues they had with it, and one was that people simply wouldn't sit for a full animated feature. They were expecting this to be basically a 70-minute long short in terms of the antics that we would produce in this. But I was insistent that we would tell a real story, that you would care about these characters by the end, and that you would still have those funny parts like we do in the shorts, and the Dwarves deliver some really wonderful, funny sequences. But truly, it's a story in which you care about the characters, and that's what it has to be to keep the audience for those 70-some minutes.
Wow. So audiences have loved it. You mentioned the critics while you were making it. What about after it came out? Were the critics as kind as the audiences?
Oh yes, they were quite complimentary of it, although there's one particular award that I had hoped we would win, which we did not. I was truly hoping for that Best Picture at the Academy Awards. However, I did get an honorary Oscar this year, which was quite an interesting statue. It had one big one and then 7 little ones for the Dwarfs, which Miss Shirley Temple gave to me.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Now, speaking of the dwarves themselves, according to what I've read, the 7 dwarves from the fairy tale didn't have names up until a 1912 Broadway play, which these weren't the same names that your writers ended up giving them. So was it this play that you might have seen that gave you the inspiration for the personalities, or did the inspiration for the dwarves come from somewhere else?
Well, within the Dwarves and knowing of the plays and the different versions of this show which had come out before, I saw great potential in the Dwarves for us to play with character animation. I feel truly what set our shorts apart from a lot of other things was that the characters really had these unique qualities to them. Pluto is distinguished not just by how he barks, but how he moves, who Pluto is. And so I thought we could really imbue these dwarves with different qualities, and we could name them for those qualities. Of course, the names took a lot of fine-tuning when we went about creating them. We had a whole board that we were working through, and some of the names didn't last very long. We had one dwarf whose name was going to be Dirty, and we cut him. We had another one, we were going to call him Snoopy, which would be a very silly name for a cartoon character, and so we, of course, threw that one away, and eventually settled on the 7 we had, but it did take some time to get there.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us in the studio today, Walt.
Oh, my pleasure.
As I'm sure the audience is aware, the real Walt Disney passed away some time ago, and so our History Alive characters are played by performers who have done thorough research into these historical figures. So today I'm also privileged to be joined by James Frummel, who plays Walt Disney for the History Alive program. Thanks so much, James.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So I'd love to talk to you about kind of the process of bringing Walt Disney to life. What inspired you to research and portray Walt Disney in particular out of all the historical figures you could have chosen?
Well, I was really interested, I've always been interested in artists, so kind of what impact artists have on the world and on American culture overall. And within Walt Disney, he's somebody who's touched so many different aspects of that. He's somebody who, yes, he moved animation forward. He took this medium, which was in its infancy, and he really brought it to new heights with what he was able to do with Snow White, and then what his artist did after that. He's also influenced how we vacation. He's influenced arts education in a big way, which I think a lot of people may not know as much about, but in kind of his third act to begin Cal Arts and the inception of that. And so he's really impacted how we think about stories in a lot of ways. He's someone who I think kind of gets pushed into this position of maybe people feel like he's more about the company of Walt Disney. So he's more about the corporate sense of what Walt Disney, the company, is now. But Disney himself was really not a businessman. In fact, he was a pretty terrible businessman. His brother Roy was really the one who actually helped keep a budget and helped kind of keep things in line there. But Walt, at his heart, was an artist. He didn't care what things cost. It was whether it was right, whether the aesthetics on this particular piece were exactly what he wanted. And where that took him to over the course of his life was just a really fascinating story.
That's interesting. Now, you also mentioned this affinity for cartoonists and artists and such, and you do also play Charles Schulz, the creator of the Peanuts comic strip, for History Alive.
Yes.
Do you find any similarities between these two figures at all? Is there any crossover besides the cartoon aspect?
One of the more interesting crossovers, I did mention one of the dwarves possibly being named Snoopy, which would have changed history in its own way there, which Charles Schulz actually commented on that one time, that he was reading through a book about Disney and said, this name was almost taken. And Schulz had actually applied to be part of Disney when Disney was in a big hiring boom post Snow White, but his work was rejected. So he had to go on and create the most successful comic strip of all time. But they were very different people in terms of how they worked. Schulz is somebody who was really about this one strip and about seeing it through to the end, and he really, from 1950 to 2000, that was his life, was this one thing. Disney was somebody who had a lot of really big passions, but they kind of fit into these different windows of his life. He's considered, a great artist for Snow White. You look at the later films, and there's some which are successful, some not so much in his lifetime, but Snow White is really his piece. And then after that, you get into World War II, and you get into Disney creating propaganda films during that time, and then post-World War II going into live-action films. He starts to step away from the animation business, and he goes into these different kind of compartments within his life. So he's somebody who had a lot of different interests, while Schulz was really just this one person this one set of characters. I would say where they perhaps have the greatest similarity is in their devotion to one particular character, and that would be, for Schulz, it was Charlie Brown and who Charlie Brown was. For Walt Disney, who Mickey Mouse was, to the point that Walt Disney was the first voice of Mickey Mouse for many, many years, not because he had dreams of being a voice actor, but simply because it needed to be right, and he felt the way that he did it was the right way. That falsetto voice was exactly how he wanted Mickey to sound. And much to the chagrin of his animators at times, Mickey Mouse turned out to be able to do very little because he could never get into trouble after the first year or two, because Mickey had to be wholesome, Mickey had to behave like the Mickey Mouse Walt Disney wanted.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be here with you here today, James.
Oh, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
If you or your organization would like to know more about History Alive, then you can contact the West Virginia Humanities Council at the number on your screen. Thank you so much for joining us.